There's a dark truth about human nature that most people refuse to acknowledge, and it's destroying their lives every single day. You've been conditioned to believe that being nice, accommodating, and always putting others first makes you a good person. But what if I told you that this very belief is the reason why people walk all over you, why your relationships lack respect, and why you feel constantly drained and unappreciated? What if the key to genuine respect, authentic relationships, and true influence lies not in endless kindness, but in something far more uncomfortable? Strategic ruthlessness. 500 years ago, a man named Niccolò Machiavelli wrote something that would forever change how we understand power, leadership, and human psychology. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Machiavelli wasn't the evil manipulator that history painted him to be. He was a keen observer of human nature, who understood something profound about the psychology of respect, influence, and relationships that most people today are desperately afraid to confront. He understood that in a world where everyone is trying to get what they want, being strategically ruthless isn't about being cruel. It's about being effective at protecting what matters most to you. Let me share something with you that happened to me early in my career, and I want you to tell me in the comments if something similar has ever happened to you. I was promoted to a management position, and I was determined to be the cool boss. I didn't want anyone to think I was a tyrant, so I let people come in late without consequences. I didn't enforce deadlines strictly because I didn't want to stress people out. I covered for team members who weren't pulling their weight because I thought that's what a supportive leader does. I said yes to every request, even when it overloaded my schedule, because I wanted to be seen as helpful and accommodating. 6 months later, my department was failing miserably. Projects were consistently late, quality was declining, and team morale was actually worse than before I took over. The people I was trying so hard to please were complaining behind my back that I was a weak leader who didn't know what I was doing. I was putting in 60-hour weeks trying to fix problems that could have been prevented with clear boundaries and consistent enforcement. I was stressed, exhausted, and questioning my abilities as a leader. But the worst part, I was failing the very people I was trying to help. This is what Machiavelli called the nice guy paradox, and it's playing out in millions of lives every day. The psychological principle behind this is simple but brutal. People don't respect what they can take advantage of. It's not that humans are inherently evil, but we are naturally inclined to test boundaries until we meet resistance. When you show unlimited kindness without consequences, you're not being virtuous, you're being naive. You're essentially advertising your willingness to be used, and most people, consciously or unconsciously, will take advantage of that. But here's where Machiavelli's genius becomes clear, and this is what separates strategic ruthlessness from simple cruelty. Machiavelli never advocated for constant harshness or unnecessary meanness. He advocated for being kind when kindness serves a purpose, and being firm when firmness is necessary. He understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. Sometimes the most protective thing you can do is establish consequences. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior. Think about a parent who never disciplines their child because they want to be the fun parent. They think they're being loving, but what they're actually doing is raising a human being who will struggle in every relationship, every job, and every challenge they face throughout their entire life. The real world has consequences, and by refusing to teach those consequences in a safe, controlled environment, that parent is setting their child up for a lifetime of painful lessons learned the hard way. This is the psychological insight that Machiavelli understood about all human relationships. Sometimes you have to be willing to be the bad guy in the short term to be the good guy in the long term. Sometimes you have to prioritize long-term growth over short-term comfort. Sometimes you have to value respect over popularity, boundaries over approval, and truth over harmony. Machiavelli wrote one of the most misunderstood quotes in history. "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." Most people interpret this as advocacy for intimidation or cruelty, but they're missing the deeper psychological truth. Machiavelli wasn't saying fear is better than love. He was observing that respect is more reliable than affection. Someone who loves you but doesn't respect you will hurt you the moment it becomes convenient for them. But someone who respects you, even if they don't particularly like you, will treat you with dignity even when you're not around to enforce it. Let me give you a real-world example of what this looks like, and I want you to comment below if you've ever been in a similar situation. You have a friend who constantly asks to borrow money and never pays it back. Every time they come to you with a sob story about being broke, you feel guilty saying no because you don't want to seem heartless or damage the friendship. So you keep lending money that you never see again, getting more and more resentful each time. Meanwhile, your friend keeps asking because they know you'll say yes, and they're actually losing respect for you because deep down, they know they're taking advantage of your kindness. The strategically ruthless response would be to say something like, "I care about you too much to keep enabling this pattern. I'm not going to lend you money anymore, but I'm happy to help you create a budget or find resources to improve your financial situation." This response might make your friend temporarily angry or disappointed, but it actually serves everyone's long-term interests. It forces them to take responsibility for their finances, it protects you from being taken advantage of, and it preserves the relationship by preventing the buildup of resentment. This is what Machiavelli meant by strategic ruthlessness. It's not about being cruel for the sake of cruelty. It's about having the courage to make difficult decisions that serve the greater good, even when those decisions make you temporarily unpopular. It's about understanding that sometimes short-term pain prevents long-term disaster. But here's the psychological principle that makes this so difficult for most people. We're wired for social connection and approval. The thought of someone being disappointed in us triggers our deepest fears of rejection and abandonment. Our brains haven't evolved to distinguish between being kicked out of the tribe, which used to mean death, and having someone be upset with us for setting a boundary, which actually strengthens relationships in the modern world. So we make decisions based on avoiding immediate social discomfort, rather than creating long-term positive outcomes. Machiavelli understood that this psychological weakness makes people vulnerable to manipulation and poor decision-making. When your need for approval overrides your judgment, you make choices that hurt everyone involved, including the people you're trying to please. You become what psychologists now call a people pleaser, which is actually one of the most selfish behaviors possible because every decision is based on managing your own discomfort with conflict rather than what's actually best for other people. The person who practices strategic ruthlessness has developed what researchers call distress tolerance. They can sit with the anxiety of someone being disappointed in them because they understand that temporary disappointment is often the price of long-term growth and respect. They've learned that being disliked for doing the right thing is infinitely better than being liked for doing the wrong thing. Let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this before you answer in the comments. How many times have you said yes to something when you should have said no, just because you didn't want to deal with the other person's reaction? How many times have you enabled someone's bad behavior because confronting it felt uncomfortable? How many times have you avoided a necessary conversation because having it would make you anxious? If you're being honest, the answer is probably more times than you want to admit. This is where Machiavelli's concept of necessity becomes crucial. He wrote extensively about situations where circumstances force us into positions where all of our choices have negative consequences, and we must choose the least harmful option. This is the reality of adult life that most people aren't prepared for. Life isn't a Disney movie where there's always a perfect solution that makes everyone happy. Sometimes you have to choose between hurting someone's feelings and hurting their future. Sometimes you have to choose between being popular and being effective. Sometimes you have to choose between enabling someone's comfort and challenging their growth. The psychological principle behind this is what researchers call moral courage. Most people have moral clarity, they know what's right, but they lack moral courage. They're not willing to pay the social price for doing what's right. Strategic ruthlessness is essentially applied moral courage. It's the willingness to endure social discomfort in service of a higher principle. But let's address the question that's probably on your mind. How do you know when you're being strategically ruthless versus just being cruel? How do you know when you're serving a greater good versus just protecting your own ego? Machiavelli himself provided the answer. Look at the long-term outcomes and examine your motivations. Strategic ruthlessness always serves the greater good, even if it's painful in the moment. Cruelty serves only the ego of the person being cruel. If you're a manager and you have to fire someone, strategic ruthlessness means having that conversation with dignity, providing clear feedback, offering support during the transition, and using the experience to improve your hiring and training processes. Cruelty means humiliating them, gossiping about their performance, or using their failure to make yourself look better. Both actions might result in the person being terminated, but the motivation and execution are completely different. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of strategic ruthlessness: timing. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of acting decisively when action is needed, rather than hoping problems will resolve themselves. Most people avoid difficult conversations until they become emergencies. They avoid setting boundaries until relationships become toxic. They avoid making hard decisions until they're forced into crisis mode. The strategically ruthless person addresses issues when they're still manageable. They have the difficult conversation early when it can still prevent bigger problems. They set boundaries before they're violated, not after. They make the hard decision when they still have options, not when they're backed into a corner. This requires a level of emotional intelligence and forward thinking that most people have undeveloped, because it means accepting short-term discomfort to prevent long-term pain. Here's something I want you to think about, and please share your thoughts in the comments because I think this will resonate with a lot of people. Have you ever noticed that when you finally do stand up for yourself or set a boundary after letting someone walk all over you for months or years, they act shocked and offended? They'll say things like, "You've changed," or "You never used to be like this," or "I don't know what's gotten into you." This reaction reveals something profound about human psychology. People become comfortable with the role you allow them to play in your life. If you've taught them that your time isn't valuable by always being available, they'll be upset when you suddenly start protecting your schedule. If you've taught them that your boundaries are negotiable by constantly making exceptions, they'll be confused when you start enforcing them consistently. If you've taught them that they can dump their problems on you without reciprocation, they'll be offended when you start expecting balance in the relationship. This is why Machiavelli emphasized the importance of consistency in leadership and relationships. Strategic ruthlessness isn't about being unpredictably harsh. It's about being predictably fair. People need to understand what to expect from you. They need to know that certain behaviors will have certain consequences. When you're consistent in your standards and consistent in your enforcement of those standards, people feel secure because they understand the rules of engagement. Think about this in terms of any successful relationship you've ever observed. The couples who have been happily married for decades aren't the ones where both people do whatever they want without consequences. They're the couples where both people have clear expectations and both people consistently meet those expectations. They respect each other's boundaries. They hold each other accountable, and they don't enable each other's worst tendencies. This isn't about being controlling, it's about being clear about what you will and won't accept in your life. The same principle applies to parenting, friendship, leadership, and any other relationship where you want long-term success and mutual respect. Children don't feel safer when parents have no rules. They feel safer when parents have clear, consistent, fair rules that are enforced with love. Employees don't perform better when managers have no standards. They perform better when managers have high standards that are clearly communicated and fairly enforced. But here's the psychological twist that most people miss. Strategic ruthlessness is not about suppressing your emotions or becoming cold and calculating. It's about understanding the difference between how you feel and what you do. You can feel compassion for someone while still holding them accountable. You can love someone deeply while refusing to enable their destructive behavior. You can care about someone's feelings while still prioritizing what's best for them in the long run. Machiavelli observed that the most effective leaders were those who could separate their personal feelings from their decision-making process. This doesn't mean becoming emotionless. It means becoming emotionally intelligent enough to recognize when your desire to be liked is interfering with your ability to do what's right. It means having the emotional maturity to accept that sometimes doing the right thing means being misunderstood, criticized, or temporarily disliked. I want to share another personal example with you, and I'm curious if anyone in the comments has experienced something similar. I had a close friend who was in a destructive relationship. Every few weeks, she would call me crying about the latest drama, asking for advice about whether she should leave. I would spend hours listening, offering support, and giving thoughtful advice about her options. But she never took any of it. She would go right back to the same toxic patterns, and then call me again when the next crisis hit. This went on for over a year. I was getting emotionally drained from these conversations, and I was starting to resent her for using me as free therapy without ever actually trying to improve her situation. But I didn't want to abandon her when she needed support, so I kept taking the calls and having the same conversations over and over again. Finally, I realized that I wasn't actually helping her. I was enabling her to stay in a bad situation by providing emotional relief without requiring any action. The strategically ruthless thing to do was to say, "I care about you, but I'm not going to keep having the same conversation. I've given you my thoughts about this situation multiple times. When you're ready to make changes instead of just talking about them, I'm here for you. But I can't keep being your emotional dumping ground while you choose to stay in circumstances that hurt you." Was she upset? Yes. Did she initially think I was being cruel and unsupportive? Absolutely. But 6 months later, she thanked me. She said that conversation was the wake-up call she needed to finally take action and leave that relationship. She realized that as long as she could call me to vent, she never had to face the full weight of her choices. My willingness to be temporarily the bad guy actually gave her the push she needed to make positive changes in her life. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote about the loneliness of leadership. Making decisions based on long-term outcomes rather than short-term popularity often means making decisions that aren't immediately understood or appreciated. It means accepting that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, and it doesn't always make you look good to others in the moment. But here's what's fascinating about the psychology of strategic ruthlessness. Once you develop this skill, your relationships actually improve dramatically. People stop taking advantage of you because they know you won't allow it. They stop pushing your boundaries because they know you'll enforce them. They start respecting your time because they know you value it. They start being more honest with you because they know you can handle the truth. Paradoxically, being willing to lose relationships by setting standards often leads to better relationships with people who meet those standards. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must be like both a lion and a fox, strong enough to fight wolves and clever enough to avoid traps. In modern psychological terms, this means you need both the courage to enforce your standards and the wisdom to know when and how to do it effectively. You need the strength to tolerate discomfort and the intelligence to communicate in ways that preserve dignity and relationship when possible. The lion aspect is about having the courage to make difficult decisions and stand by them even when they're unpopular. It's about having the strength to say no when no is the right answer, regardless of how people react. It's about having the fortitude to hold people accountable even when doing so makes you temporarily the bad guy. The fox aspect is about choosing your battles wisely and communicating in ways that maximize understanding and minimize unnecessary damage. It's about timing your difficult conversations when they're most likely to be heard. It's about framing your boundaries in terms of what you're protecting rather than what you're preventing. It's about being strategic in how you enforce your standards so that you achieve your goals without causing unnecessary harm. Let me give you a practical example of what this looks like. Let's say you have a coworker who constantly interrupts you in meetings and takes credit for your ideas. The lion in you gives you the courage to address this behavior, but the fox in you chooses the right approach. Instead of calling them out aggressively in front of everyone, which would create unnecessary drama and make you look petty, you might have a private conversation where you say something like, "I've noticed that we sometimes talk over each other in meetings. I'd like to make sure we're both able to share our ideas effectively. Can we agree to let each other finish our thoughts before responding?" This approach addresses the behavior without attacking the person. It frames the conversation in terms of mutual benefit rather than accusation. It gives them an opportunity to change their behavior without losing face. But if the behavior continues, you escalate appropriately, perhaps by saying in the next meeting, "Let me finish this thought, and then I'd love to hear your perspective." This is strategic ruthlessness in action. You're not avoiding the conflict, but you're not being unnecessarily aggressive either. You're being clear about your boundaries while giving the other person every opportunity to respect them. But you're also prepared to enforce those boundaries publicly if private conversations don't work. Now, let me ask you something that I think will generate some interesting discussion in the comments. How many of you have ever been called too sensitive or difficult when you try to set boundaries or stand up for yourself? How many of you have been told you are overreacting when you called out behavior that was clearly inappropriate? How many of you have been made to feel guilty for having standards or expectations in your relationships? This is one of the ways that people try to manipulate you back into being someone they can take advantage of. When someone calls you difficult for having boundaries, what they're really saying is that you're difficult to exploit. When someone says you're too sensitive for calling out their behavior, what they're really saying is that they want you to tolerate things that you shouldn't tolerate. When someone tries to make you feel guilty for having standards, they're revealing that they do not meet those standards and they do not want to do the work to improve. Machiavelli understood that people will always try to shape you into the version of yourself that serves their interests, not yours. This is why he emphasized the importance of being willing to be misunderstood. You can't control how people interpret your actions, but you can control whether your actions are based on solid principles and clear thinking. The strategically ruthless person has learned to be comfortable with being called difficult, demanding, or high maintenance by people who don't want to meet reasonable standards. They understand that these labels are often badges of honor that indicate they're successfully protecting their time, energy, and values from people who would exploit them. But here's something crucial that I want everyone to understand. Developing strategic ruthlessness does not mean becoming harsh, cold, or unfeeling. It means becoming selective about where you direct your kindness and generosity. Instead of being nice to everyone regardless of how they treat you, you become exceptionally kind to people who respect your boundaries and consistently cruel to people who violate them. No, wait, that's not right. You don't become cruel to anyone. You simply stop rewarding bad behavior with continued access to your time, energy, and resources. This is what Machiavelli called enlightened self-interest. When you refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, you're serving their interests as well as your own. When you hold people accountable, you're helping them develop the skills they need to succeed in other relationships. When you set boundaries, you're protecting the relationship from the resentment and toxicity that inevitably builds up when one person consistently takes advantage of another. The person who lacks this understanding operates from what psychologists call trauma bonding or codependency patterns. They make decisions based on their own discomfort with conflict, not on what's actually best for other people. They enable destructive behavior because confronting it makes them feel anxious. They avoid difficult conversations because having them triggers their fear of abandonment. They say yes when they should say no, because saying no activates their guilt and shame responses. Everything becomes about managing their own emotional reactions, rather than creating healthy relationship dynamics. This is actually a form of emotional immaturity disguised as kindness. True maturity means being able to tolerate your own discomfort in service of better outcomes for everyone involved. Machiavelli also understood something profound about human psychology that modern research has confirmed. People value most what they have to earn. When you give people everything they want without them having to work for it, they don't value it. They take it for granted. This applies to relationships, careers, parenting, and leadership. The manager who makes their team earn respect and recognition creates a culture of excellence. The parent who makes their child earn privileges creates a responsible adult. The friend who maintains boundaries creates a relationship built on mutual respect, rather than one-sided exploitation. The romantic partner who doesn't accept poor treatment creates a dynamic where both people bring their best selves to the relationship. Think about your own experiences with this principle. Haven't you noticed that you tend to respect people more who have clear standards and stick to them? Haven't you noticed that you sometimes lose respect for people who let you get away with behavior that you know is unacceptable? Haven't you noticed that the relationships where you had to earn someone's trust and respect are often the most meaningful ones in your life? This is because humans are psychologically wired to value scarcity and to devalue abundance. If your time, attention, and energy are freely available to everyone, regardless of how they treat you, they become less valuable in people's minds. But if access to you requires meeting certain standards of behavior, suddenly that access becomes precious and people work to maintain it. Now, I want to talk about something that I think will resonate with a lot of viewers, especially those of you who consider yourselves empathetic or highly sensitive people. You might be thinking that this approach sounds selfish or harsh. You might be worried that setting boundaries will make you a bad person, or that holding people accountable will damage your relationships. Let me tell you something that changed my entire perspective on this. The most empathetic thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive patterns. The most loving thing you can do is hold people to high standards. The most caring thing you can do is have the difficult conversations that help people grow, even when those conversations are uncomfortable for everyone involved. When you constantly rescue people from the natural consequences of their choices, you rob them of the opportunity to learn and grow. When you enable someone's irresponsible behavior by always cleaning up their messes, you prevent them from developing the skills they need to succeed in life. When you avoid conflict by accepting treatment that isn't acceptable, you teach people that they don't need to treat you with respect. This isn't about being mean or punitive. This is about understanding that real love sometimes requires you to be willing to be temporarily disliked for someone's long-term benefit. Real friendship sometimes means having conversations that make both of you uncomfortable, but ultimately strengthen the relationship. Real leadership sometimes means making decisions that are unpopular in the moment, but create better outcomes for everyone in the long run. Machiavelli observed that people often don't know what's good for them in the present moment, but they usually recognize it in retrospect. The child who hated their parents' rules often becomes grateful for them as an adult. The employee who was held to high standards often later realizes it made them better at their job. The friend who was confronted about their destructive behavior often eventually appreciates the person who cared enough to speak up. But here's the psychological challenge. You might never get that later recognition. The person might never realize that your difficult decision was actually good for them. They might never thank you for setting boundaries or holding them accountable. You have to be willing to do the right thing, even when you don't get credit for it, even when you don't get the satisfaction of being recognized as the good guy. This is what separates strategic ruthlessness from people-pleasing. People pleasers make decisions based on getting immediate positive feedback. They need constant validation and approval to feel good about themselves. Strategically ruthless people make decisions based on creating long-term positive outcomes, regardless of whether those decisions are immediately appreciated or understood. If this video has given you a new perspective on boundaries, relationships, or leadership, smash that like button to help more people discover these ideas. The YouTube algorithm needs to know that this kind of content resonates with people, because understanding these principles isn't just about personal success. It's about creating a world where people treat each other with genuine respect rather than just surface-level niceness. And if you want to continue exploring the psychology of influence, power dynamics, and effective decision-making, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we dive deep into these topics regularly. This isn't content for people who want easy answers or comfortable truths. This is for people who are ready to do the hard work of understanding how the world really works and how to navigate it with both strength and integrity. The comments section is where these ideas really come alive, so don't just watch and leave. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your questions, your disagreements. Tell me about a time when being too nice backfired on you. Tell me about a boundary you need to set, but you're scared to enforce. Tell me about a difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Tell me about a relationship where you've realized you're giving way more than you're receiving. Your perspective and experiences can help other viewers understand these concepts better and realize they're not alone in struggling with these challenges. And who knows, your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read to finally find the courage to make the changes they know they need to make in their own lives. Remember, strategic ruthlessness isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's about becoming who you really are underneath all the people-pleasing and conflict avoidance. It's about aligning your actions with your deepest values, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about caring enough to do what's right, not just what's easy. And it's about understanding that in a world full of complexity and competing interests, good outcomes often require the courage to make choices that aren't immediately popular or understood. So what's it going to be? Are you going to keep choosing the easy path of avoiding difficult decisions and wondering why people don't respect you the way you respect them? Or are you ready to develop the psychological tools that will make you truly effective at creating positive change in your life and in the lives of the people around you? The choice, as Machiavelli understood, is always yours. But now you understand what that choice really means and why it matters so much for everything you want to accomplish in your relationships, your career, and your life.